Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And as many listeners know, one of the big things that Redeeming Babel is doing to try to help people out there is our multi-pronged project called the After Party. The After Party seeks to equip Christians to serve as a healing presence in this era of political division. Now, that's the content. The distribution strategy of the After Party, well, it's making a big bet on the local church. We're making a big bet on the potential of the local church to be a healing agent in this era of division. And this is why we've designed the After Party the way we have. We started out with a video course that's designed for small groups, especially Bible studies, men's groups, women's groups, small groups, Sunday schools, prayer breakfasts, whatever. But the ways in which the local church is organized around small groups, we wanted to design content to equip those local churches and their small groups. And this is also why we wrote the book version of the After Party, because I had a conversation with Pastor Renee in Santa Cruz, who I think is listening out there. Shout out to Pastor Renee, who told me, look, our church doesn't do video courses. Many churches still go through contents, even in their small groups, through books. Curtis, you've got to write a book. So that's why I wrote the book with Nancy French of the After Party, the book version. And that got me thinking, okay, what else do churches need? And that's when I started realizing, oh, we have this big content gap in churches around worship and worship songs, that if we were to try to lead our people to be formed, to be agents of healing, we don't really have the songs that equip our people to inspire them in that mission. And that's why we created the Songs for the After Party project with Porter's Gate to create a set of new worship songs that would equip our people in their life of worship to be agents of healing. So all of that is we are making a big bet on the local church to be an agent of healing, which raises this question. Was that a smart bet? Like, how would we know? How would we evaluate whether and how the local church can actually make a difference in this divided world? And that question really hangs over the After Party. And it's so much the reason why I'm grateful that we have partnered in the After Party with my guest for this episode, Professor Hahrie Han. Hahrie Han is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute. She's a professor of political science and faculty director at Johns Hopkins University. She's an award-winning author of 4 books and numerous articles about how organizations contribute to civic engagement and democracy, including her most recent book, Undivided, which explores the potential of evangelical churches for healing racial divides. And it was her work on that topic that led us to partner with her and her center at Johns Hopkins University to help us evaluate the impact of the After Party project. Okay, so with that long introduction, Hahrie, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, Hahrie, let's talk about this topic that really is the subject of your most recent book. What is the potential of a local church to make a difference in this era of division? Tell us about the work that you're doing that's behind this book, Undivided.
Yeah. So I think the short answer is I think the local church has a tremendous amount of potential. And that's really what drew me to tell the story that's in the book. What the book does essentially is it traces 4 people who are part of one church in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a mega church called Crossroads. And all 4 of them are involved in a program called Undivided that was founded in Crossroads, but now operates in churches across the country. And what the program does is really tries to animate people to get involved in questions around racial healing, both in their church, but also in their broader community, and then supports them through a journey of that. And I think what was really fascinating to me about the story was the ability of people through the work that they did in their church to not only get involved in the beginning, but to sort of stay involved in more durable ways than what we see in a lot of other social change efforts. Because as I'm sure, you're seeing in the work that you all are doing with the After Party, or that I know that we've talked about, is that this is not the thing that it's not one and done, right? You don't do it once, you don't have one conversation and then walk away from it. It just takes sustained, steady engagement and a kind of commitment to a set of values and a set of practices that you have to engage over a long period of time through the ups and downs of the crazy world that we live in. And that's what we saw in this church. And I thought, this is not unusual in so many different ways. And I really wanted to kind of dive in and understand how it was that they were able to build and sustain this kind of work.
Okay, there's so much there for us to unpack. And I want to just also let listeners know that Undivided is the project that was co-founded by Chuck Mingo, who has been on this podcast before. And I really viewed Undivided as sort of my first beacon of light to say, okay, keep going down this road because somebody else has done this in a adjacent, very closely related topic of social division. And so that really gave me a lot of confidence, especially when I met Hahrie at a conference and she was telling me, yeah, I'm actually studying this. I thought, okay, it really was a key point for the development of the after party. So I'm so grateful, Hahrie, that you got there ahead of our efforts. But before we unpack more this I think unique potential of the local church to be an agent of healing, before we unpack that, I want to ask you to tell us the origin story, because how did you, as a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University, find this church in the sort of evangelical megachurch world in Ohio, of all places? Tell the origin story to this.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So in my day job as a professor of political science, a lot of what I do is try to understand the role that different kinds of organizations play in trying to pull people off the sidelines of public life and get them involved in trying to make their communities a better place, essentially. So that's a lot of what my broader kind of work is on. And I had learned about a campaign that had happened in the city of Cincinnati in 2016 around universal preschool. And that's what first brought me to Cincinnati. And I was studying this campaign and trying to understand how was it that in this unusual political moment, the city was able to pass this and build this huge new program that was really trying to ameliorate inequality in the city. And people kept saying, there's this church and they're sending all these volunteers, and the volunteers played a big role in the campaign. And I hear that all the time, and I've done a lot of work with faith-based community organizations and community organizers in the past. And usually they operate at a pretty small scale. They'll send 10 or 15 volunteers maybe, and they'll make some phone calls. And I mean, it's really important and worthy work, but it doesn't usually it doesn't come up again and again and again in the way that it kept coming up in this campaign. So after I heard it from a number of people, I just started to dig into it. And finally I realized that it wasn't just 10 or 12 volunteers. It was hundreds of volunteers that showed up week after week after week after week for this campaign, and that they were coming from an evangelical megachurch. And I thought, okay, this is really different, right? Both in terms of the number of volunteers and the dedication that they showed over time, but also the fact that they were coming from what is often perceived as a church that sometimes can be perceived as being politically more divisive than actually kind of trying to heal social division. And I should qualify this by saying I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church. I grew up in Texas, and my parents were immigrants from Korea. We grew up in the Catholic Church, and I think that Catholicism, as you might know, is very different from Protestantism and evangelicalism in a lot of ways. I'm used to a very hierarchical kind of church structure, and so I wasn't very familiar with evangelicalism except for what I had heard in the news. And if you just read the news, then it sounds like, gosh, this really doesn't seem like the kind of place that I would think would be, sending all these volunteers. And so that's what first drew me into the story. And then the more I dug into it, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm learning so much, not only about the potential that one church or a set of leaders within a church has to make change, but also just kind of broader questions that I think about all the time in terms of how organizations can heal social divisions, how they can bring people together, just, so many of these different kind of themes that I think have intersected with a lot of the other work that I've done.
Hahrie, there's so much in what you said that I think is really inspiring to me and hopeful to me. One of this is the fact that really what happened, it sounds like, is this church in Cincinnati created a puzzle. It created an intriguing question. And that intriguing question was, what's motivating these people? Because they're not conforming to the expectations of our divided, polarized age. Because it sounds like, from what I understand, you've got this church that is highly mobilized to work on a cause that just by the strict right-left binaries that we sort everything would say, oh, that's a cause of the left. That's a progressive cause, universal preschool. and yet in its identity is an evangelical church. So it's like it's creating a what, huh?
Right.
And as in the Christian terms, we would call that a parable. This is what Jesus tells people to make them sit up and say, what, huh? Wait, what's going on there? And what I love about that story is it's a living parable of the gospel that says our identity in Jesus does not conform to the patterns of the world, to quote Paul in Romans. It is being transformed by a higher authority, by Jesus himself, in a way that does not fit. And so it should create puzzles, it should create parables, including our political work, such that we should find Christians who, if they're really centered on Jesus, just zigzagging all over the place on the standard political map, because we're not following the political map. Our mind isn't being shaped by the standard political categories. So we should be always presenting such parables. So I love that. Unpack that a little more in terms of when you dove into the church. Did you find that happening? Did you find more and more of these, I've got somebody who's socially conservative but willing to entertain this liberal thing, or somebody who's socially liberal but actually theologically holds this conservative view? What did you find?
Yes, I love the way that you put that. This idea that, if I only read the newspaper, never went to any church, right? Then all I would do is kind of see people in these categories and in these boxes, right? But the truth of the matter is, most Christians, I think, and most people really, quite frankly, don't fit as neatly into those boxes as like media likes to portray us, right? We're all complicated humans. And I think that one of the things that's a real challenge right now is that a lot of people kind of feel that complexity in themselves, but they don't necessarily feel like there's a place they can go to fully express that and to learn and to meet other people who are grappling with similar kinds of questions. And so in a way, Undivided was able to tap into, I think, that feeling that a lot of people had. There's a hunger that was already there. And so I don't know if Chuck talked about this when you had him on his podcast, but the way that Undivided began was in 2015, there had been a police shooting of an unarmed Black man in Cincinnati that had, kind of opened up this conversation around racial inequality in the city. And Chuck, as, the highest ranking Black pastor in Crossroads at the time, kind of stood up on the main stage one Sunday. He said, I feel called to be a voice of racial healing, racial reconciliation in the city. And he wasn't really he wasn't doing that thinking he was going to build this program that then became Undivided. He was doing that because that's what he felt called to preach about that Sunday. And there was an outpouring of support that came to him from the congregation. Thousands of people from the congregation reached out and said, I don't know what you're going to do, but whatever you do, I want to be a part of it. And he was so taken aback by the volume of support that came his way. He realized they can't just walk away from it, right? They have to create something that responds to the hunger that people had. And so he put together a leadership team of people from around the church, but also other leaders from the city. And they developed a program that eventually became Undivided. And I think one of the things that is really true about Undivided, and one of the things I really took away from the research that we did with this that I think really speaks to what you're talking about, is that we live in a world in which people like the media and the political discourse that we hear tries to treat people's identities as categories. And what Undivided did is by putting people into small groups, by having them develop real authentic relationships with each other that didn't shy away from questions of difference and division, but instead confronted them head on, that people were able to reimagine or come to understand identity not as a set of categories, but as a set of experiences. And when you begin to understand it that way, then of course, we all have different experiences. We all have different kind of complexity and nuance that we bring to the lenses that we use to see the world. And I think grounding it in relationship that way was really powerful. And part of, just to the introduction that you gave, I think part of the reason why the local church is not only a possible place of transformation, but an essential place of it, because you can't build that kind of relationship, without having it grounded in local communities and local entities like the church.
Right, because if you immediately set up the conversation around the lines that the media or even scholars sort of, categorize people in, it's immediately us versus them starting point, right? Like it's like, and we struggled this in creating the after party course because, the way you want to create these courses is you want to begin often with a way for people to locate themselves in this experience that you want to take them to. But how do you do that? The standard way a lot of political, anti-political polarization courses do this, when I was looking at this, was they start with a political quiz on the substance, on the ideological substance of your belief. So you take a quiz and everybody's immediately mapped out on a progressive versus conservative spectrum. But the problem with that is that immediately you've given away the game at some level at the beginning. You've already accepted the starting categories of identity, and now you're having to work against that. And you've gotten everybody thinking, oh, I'm the progressive, you're the conservative. You're already locating yourselves in this, us versus them spectrum. So we really looked for a different way to help people identify themselves, and the way we came up with was on the sort of hope humility spectrum, to say let's actually think of ourselves along the virtues that Jesus calls us to, and we ended up creating these 2x2s, which I won't go into details. But basically, these 4 categories of exhausted, combatant, cynic, and disciple. And the feedback we're getting from people is that it's such a helpful framework because it's more complex than simple political substance, content. And it also cross-cuts ideological divides because you can be a Republican exhausted and a Democrat exhausted, a Republican cynic and a Democratic cynic. And so you find these cross-cutting identifications that heals and moderates against the ways we divide so much along ideology. So, and that, of course, I think what we're talking about is really one of the unique potential distinctives of the local church, is because you have people who are being brought together not on ideological grounds, hopefully, but really on faith grounds. And so you can have the conversation start on different identity grounds other than the political ones. Hahrie, what else about the local church as you think of it and you compare it to other secular civic associations, make it a distinctive agent of potential healing?
Yeah. Okay. Before I answer that question, I just want to say one thing to the point that you were just making before that, which is, Crossroads has this phrase that I think a lot of other churches also use, but, I sort of felt like it was the first time I'd seen them really put it into practice, seen an organization that puts it into practice as vividly as Crossroads does, which is this idea that belonging comes before belief, and I think that in a way is, it's such a powerful antidote to the way that most of our public and political lives are structured, to the point that you were just making, that in most cases it feels like belief comes first and then belonging comes second. So first you have to show me that you're a member of my tribe because we agree on these key dimensions or whatever they are, right? And then once you show that you believe the same things, then you're welcomed into our community of belonging, and Crossroads is really clear that, look, we are a church. Our role is around bringing people to Jesus and into relationship with Jesus. But you know what? Like, you don't have to be someone who believes in our God or a God. You can be seeking, you can be questioning, but no matter what you bring into this community, like, you're a part of our community, like, you're welcome. And that kind of spirit of creating this radical belonging, I think, really created a kind of cultural foundation that made Undivided possible. So people came into Undivided, some of whom had thought a lot about questions about race and racial injustice and racial division in America, and some who really hadn't, and yet they were all welcomed into this community of belonging. And then kind of, once we sort of established some of those kind of shared, basic human characteristics, then we could then explore some of these questions around belief and difference and race and so on. So anyway, I just want to kind of underscore in a way.
Okay, wait, before we go back to the whole question of other distinctives, I want to hop onto your comment because it's really, a light bulb went up for me when you said that, which is you're making the connection to the church's DNA as this big evangelical megachurch, which really is built on the seeker model, the megachurch evangelical seeker church model, which especially was really in the heyday in the, I would say, the early 2000s. Sure. It's the Willow Creek, and so forth, and it strikes me that actually that ethos, that DNA, which the evangelical movement so much harnessed on just strict religious status, that it was like, we're not gonna make belonging about you subscribing to these set of religious beliefs at the outset, right? We're gonna make belonging wider than that, and actually as a predecessor to getting everybody lined up on the correct beliefs theologically or religiously, spiritually. That is the exact DNA we need in politics.
Yeah.
That we need a ethos that is the belonging to this community, especially at the local level, is bigger, greater on different grounds than we all subscribe to the same beliefs. And it strikes me that evangelical churches actually have the DNA to make this move if they can just apply it to topics like race and politics, right? Because we have cultivated, yes, this is how we are to be in the world. We're supposed to be open arms, wide room for people seeking. You don't have to subscribe to the same things right away. But we need that exact ethos in the divisive topics of race and politics. Do you see that connection in Undivided, that they were able to make the transfer of this set of DNA into race?
Absolutely. I mean, 100%. And I will just say, so again, so I was raised in the Catholic Church, and I kind of characterize myself now kind of as a seeker, like someone who is trying, the Catholic Church, I felt like there were parts of it that didn't feel like it quite aligned with the way that I understood the role of God and God in my life. And so I think in my adulthood, I've still been trying to seek and kind of find the right community for me. And that's how I entered into this relationship with Crossroads. And so I sort of, in some ways, was like the target person, for a seeker sensitive church. And, but as I began to understand some of these things that we're talking about, I went back and kind of read up on the history of where did Willow Creek come from, and what was the missionary tradition on which it was built, and kind of looked at the work of people like Don McGavran and Robert Scott, and like all these people that had sort of formed the foundation of what eventually became kind of these seeker-sensitive megachurches. And I absolutely think that you're right, that even though a lot of that philosophy was built around this question of bringing people to God, the notion of what it takes in terms of putting people into relationship with each other, building on, kind of their authentic experience and helping them begin to sort of see what it means to be part of something bigger. All of those things are very resonant with what we wish, I think, a lot of our political institutions would do, but in fact, they don't. They operate on almost the opposite philosophy that creates the kind of social division that I think the after party is now trying to heal. And so, yes, I think that's absolutely right in terms of the way in which you can take the DNA that's already there and just begin to think about it, not only in the context of people's relationship to God or their faith commitments, but also in terms of how they might orient to each other and some of the politics of our current moment.
We've been talking about so many aspects of the local church because it is founded under Jesus. It has a higher identity that transcends the standard left-right political divides, or even the standard racial identity divides that so dominate the way we are shaped to relate to each other. It has that. It has the ability to actually create an emphasis on belonging first versus everybody lining up on the correct set of beliefs. And that's what we've been talking about. I want to unpack this some more about what it is that is about the local church that really has a unique potential and sometimes realized potential. And Hahrie, I want to actually offer this observation and get your reactions to this. I think a lot of local church pastors feel like, I don't know what to do. These issues are so divisive, so big, they're beyond me. I don't have what it takes. And it strikes me that actually, if they can just kind of open their eyes, they actually have, in ways that almost no one else has, a tool to actually address both racial and political division. Obviously, actually, I would say a transcendent tool and an immanent tool. A transcendent tool, of course, is the gospel. It is our highest allegiance to Jesus and Jesus' very presence in the church through the Spirit, which is something we can explore later. But there's an immanent tool. By that, I mean something that we can observe physically and concretely. When which is this thing called small groups.
Mm-hmm.
Because most evangelical churches are organized by small groups, at least for their ways that they foster community. Again, this is the weekly or biweekly gathering of folks that either do Bible study or discussion or book clubs or Sunday schools, men's groups, and so forth. It is pervasive in the structure of the evangelical church. And I always tell pastors, like, do you not realize how rare this is? Like, if we think about what has happened in our broader society, and we follow the studies of people like Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone, and how the secular spaces to gather people in small communities, face-to-face embodied relationships over time, those have been so eviscerated. I mean, this is why his title of his book was about bowling alone. Like, even bowling leagues have been hollowed out. And I tell people, it's like, I struggle outside of the higher education context to name any civic structure that gathers people together over a long period of time for face-to-face relationships and to have substantive conversations and reflections on like topics, on contents, that reads stuff, to discuss this, and then actually expect each other to apply this in their real life, and will support and hold each other. And if they have a surgery, we'll bake casseroles for them. Like I think the closest equivalent that I could come up with was 12-step groups. I think that's the closest equivalent, and that actually grew out of the Christian church tradition as well.
Yeah.
So am I right in that just intuition that churches with small groups have this incredibly rare social resource to bring onto problems of political and racial division?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I say, if I put on my professor hat for a moment, is that sometimes, the problems that we face in our broader kind of socio-political life are, like, one way to characterize them is that it's really more of a supply side problem than a demand side problem. And so what I mean by that is, if we think about it as a demand side problem, the questions that we ask are things like, why are people so divided? Why aren't they tolerant of the other side? And I actually think that if you look at the data and the experiences that people have, there are some people who are very, carry some animosity, but most Americans are exhausted. Like you said, it's kind of like on the scale that you all develop. Most people are actually hungry to hear people who aren't just, going to echo back, the same ideas that they already hold, to kind of be in relationship with all different kinds of people. And there just aren't those kind of opportunities for us to encounter those kinds of people as often as we used to, So if I used to go bowling with, people who love to bowl, but might be really politically different from me, then I would naturally have the opportunity to build those kind of relationships and have those kinds of interactions. And now I just don't, because we've lost the supply side, right? The supply of those organizations, except, as you point out, churches, still play this incredible role in providing that kind of opportunity. And particularly, I think the small group is really important. And just to kind of like give a little bit of intuition for why the small group I think is so important is one analogy that I like to use sometimes is, basically the idea that, our behaviors flow from the commitments that we have, right? And so, my husband and I have been married for 25 years. Like, we have a lovely, I'm, very grateful for our relationship, but like, so when we disagree, when we fight like we want to stay married, right? We don't fight like we want to get divorced, right? And, I'm sure if you looked at, relationships, you can see like some people fight like they want to actually break up, and some people fight like they want to stay together, right? And so, yes, of course we disagree, but we're committed to figuring out how we're going to forge a common life together. And so that means that when we disagree in ways that make that possible. And I think the same thing is true if you think not just about our families, but about, any community that you're a part of. Either you disagree in ways that help you forge this common life, or ways that break that possibility of that common life apart. And I think one of the things that the small groups do is they create this crucible of commitment and relationship. It's the casseroles that you bring when someone's mom is sick. I mean, all the things that you're talking about, those are the things that forge the kind of commitments that say, you know what, like, even if I don't totally agree with you, like, you were there for me when I really needed it. And so I have this commitment to you that's going to make me want to figure this out with you, and it's the same thing that we do in our families. And, in a church like Crossroads, which now is a 35,000 person church, I can't forge that kind of relationship, obviously, with the entire community. And so that's why the small group is really crucial for creating that commitment, which then creates a set of behaviors that enable the kind of work that, the after party and Undivided and other programs like that want people to embody.
Yeah. So, Hahrie, I want you to draw from your insights from your book and your research on Undivided and like help me. So listeners can listen in. This is a consulting session you're going to hear in live. Like, what should we keep really first and foremost in our minds? What are in terms of how we're executing on the after party? What were the key takeaways that really should govern any effort to heal political division through small group communities?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the things that we've already talked about, right? So first, this notion that belonging comes before belief, right? And so that people have to feel like they are in relationship with each other so that they generate the kind of commitments that are necessary. One thing I think that we haven't talked about that I think is really relevant too is that people have to feel like they're free to try their own way of solving some of the problems that they see, that they feel like. I think, a lot of time the temptation is to sort of say, like, let me spoon feed you, a set of actions that will essentially be the solution to all the problems that you have. And sometimes people need that, and that can be a good sort of starter way of getting people involved. But if that's all people do, then they never take ownership of the work themselves. And I think that's one of the things that I really saw in Undivided is that at a certain point, people had to move from just being kind of consumers of sort of insight about kind of racial healing and racial reconciliation to actually becoming sort of producers of ways to confront racial divisiveness in their community or in their own lives. And making that transition, it's just like learning, it's like anytime you learn anything, like you don't read a manual on how to ride a bike and then get up on the bike and ride it, right? You get up on the bike and then you fall off, and you get up on the bike again and you fall off. And it's that process of trying and failing that is really important, which again, I think happens really crucially within the context of a small group where that's kind of ground zero for learning what works and what doesn't work. How does it fit with my life? What feels consistent with my values, with my understanding of what Jesus is calling me to do? Like all of those things, people have to navigate and come to decisions on their own about.
Hahrie, I love that you're bringing up, it's such a helpful insight, this distinction between the consumer posture versus the producer posture, and why the move from the consumer to the producer posture is so crucial to healing. And I think it highlights the flip side of the evangelical church's potential here. Because if on the positive side, it has, for instance, this DNA of being seeker-oriented, such that people who don't believe the same thing you do could still belong to your community. And that mega church seeker movement of the evangelical world, that really is a potential to unlock there. There's a shadow side to that movement, which is that movement was also very much built, I think, on tapping into a consumer mindset. Like, this is a mega church, so you're producing experiences, especially sometimes large scale experiences where people can sit back. And in some ways that helps the initial stage of a seeker because they could be anonymous. They don't have to actually participate. Right. They can just like consume this great content and then slide out the door at the end. That's actually good for the large group Sunday morning service gathering. Unfortunately, that mentality can pervade also the DNA of an evangelical church of all sizes, but I think especially the larger the size that the church gets, the more it slips just into the consumer mindset because the business model requires that. It's like, we've got a lot of people, we've got a smaller number of staff. What that means is large events, which people sit back and consume content that the small number of staff produce, right? So it inherently tilts things into this consumer mindset. But what you're saying is, okay, maybe that's okay to get them in the door, but you've got to actually get them then into settings where they can get out of that consumer mindset into producer mindset. And small groups, that's one reason why small groups are so crucial to any church, because we're just not going to go deeper, especially on the really hard stuff where you actually can't just master a few key, the 3 points that all happen to start with the letter C or something like that. But to actually do this hard stuff. What else do pastors need to really recognize if they really want to lean into either race or politics? What have you observed? Like, look, if you're a pastor, you're really to, dive into this. you really got to think about this, be ready for this, consider this.
Yeah. So just to kind of build on the first thing that you said, just to reiterate, I think that's absolutely right. The small group is the kind of antidote to the consumer mindset that you're talking about. And so it becomes really crucial in that way. The other thing I should also just clarify is, and the book kind of traces the story, is that, Undivided is a 6-week program that takes people on this journey towards anti-racism. And then they also, at the end, they invite people into what they call Onramps, which are opportunities to continue the work. And so what the Onramps do essentially is they create another vehicle or another structure through which, after that kind of 6-week curriculum is over, people can continue to deepen and expand and explore in the relationships that they have. And so, there's no 6-week program in the world that is going to take someone and be like, now we've learned everything and go forth and you're done, right? Like, in fact, the 6-week program is just the spark. It was people's ongoing work through the justice team or through the 4-7 or through these other on-ramps that they had that kind of enable people to take what they learned in that 6 weeks and put it into practice in their lives. And inevitably, when they put it into practice in their lives, things didn't go exactly as they expected, right? And then when things don't go as you expected, then how do you kind of learn to navigate that uncertainty? And that's where those on-ramps are really important. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that piece of it.
No, actually, I think that answers one of the questions I was asking you, is that pastors have to make a long-term commitment to be helping their churches become this healing agent, either in race or politics or both. Because if you think of it as, it's 2024, it's an election year, we got to have some program about politics. And you think of it, again, in programmatic consumer terms. It's like, okay, this is our product lineup for this season. We'll run it out for 6 weeks. The after party is also a 6-week course. And then you think, okay, that'll do it. You will be sorely disappointed, right? Because we're very clear, like, we view the after party not as this magic pill, but really, like you said, as the catalyst to get this going and get these conversations going. It's also why I have so far steadfastly resisted people's requests for us to form our own virtual small groups, because people are like, I don't have a local church. I don't know if I can start this in my local church. Can you start a virtual, sort of group?
Right.
And I've always resisted that, because I don't think just getting like random 12 people together for 6 weeks, it'll be good. It'll be somewhat helpful, but it's not really the vision of what I have for the after party. It has to get inserted into ongoing communities and relationships that will last beyond these 6 weeks for the 6 weeks to actually have the desired impact. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think I would share that intuition, in the sense that it was like Undivided, created a set of relationships that were nested in this broader community, the church, Crossroads, which is then nested in the city, Cincinnati, and so it was people kind of like committing to a set of relationships and a set of practices that pervaded, not just their, Sunday morning interactions or their small group meetings on Tuesday night, but kind of everything that they were dealing with. And I think that embeddedness is really important, and it's really different when you pluck people out and then put them into a relationship where they're not having to confront that. So I think that's exactly right. An analogy that I can use sometimes is the idea that if you imagine, like, when you start a fire, there's first you light the tinder, and the tinder heats up the kindling, and then the kindling heats up the big fire. And the way you sustain the big fire is not by striking the match on the big log at the beginning, but by investing in the tinder, which is next to the kindling, and so on. So if we carry the analogy forward, it's the idea that, the people who go through the after party, they're like the tinder and the kindling, and then it's their natural proximity to other people in their community through their social networks and so on, that are then going to be able to kind of build and hopefully sustain a fire over the long period of time. And so if you pluck people away from the natural proximity to the fuel log or to the other people in their community, then the kind of the sparks from the fire kind of get dissipated out in a way that never builds the actual fire that you want, And so I think that investment in a place does really matter in that sense.
Right, and to stretch your metaphor to its absolute breaking point, like, you need other kinds of logs to keep that fire going. This is why I don't actually think it's that healthy to create a group that is solely focused on politics forever, for the long term. It's like, it just strains things too much. Or even, honestly, I don't think even race, right? Like, because you want a different mix. You want, like, okay, we've done 6 weeks on politics. Now we're going to study Romans, or now we're going to talk about the Holy Spirit. Now we're going to talk about parenting, right? Yeah. And then you come back to race, and then you talk about, some other topic, because life is all of that. And if you try to reduce life to one topic, that's, again, that reductionistic sort of dynamic that actually ends up dividing people more than uniting them, because we're actually united on the diversity and complexity of what human life actually is.
Right. And humans don't experience the world. And, it's not like, well, now this is the, racial part of me that's experiencing this. And then here's the political part of me. And then here's the faith part. It sort of is like, we are all humans and we experience the world, and all these things kind of is intertwined. And so too, should the entities that we're invited into. And so I think that intuition is right. The other thing I just want to say on the kind of question I never quite sort of fully picked up on is just in terms of what pastors should expect is, I think one thing that I saw certainly in Undivided, and I think is also true in some of the other work that we've seen, is that often the first voices to speak up are often the ones that are kind of like the furthest on the extremes. And there's often kind of, whether it's an exhausted or a quieter or maybe a more unsure kind of middle, that can often be a lot larger than the sort of voices that you hear first, but aren't necessarily the first one to speak up, because they're not necessarily the ones that have thought about this as much or as passionate about it. So I think sometimes it takes some time for that questioning and for that exploration and that curiosity to begin to emerge. But being patient and giving space and creating space for that to happen is really important, I think, both for the leadership to understand where the congregation really is, but then also for people who may not have the opportunity to speak up if they're not given that space to actually find the opportunity to do so. Because I think, we live in a political world where information kind of travels really fast, and we're constantly bombarded with things. And so sometimes it's like things come in, you have a reaction, and like the moment has passed before you even have a chance to think about what you really feel, and so you want to just create that time and that space. I think is something that we saw a lot in Undivided.
I love that. Patience and creating space. Hahrie, I want to ask you this question sort of as a social scientist and somebody who appreciates and has her own faith journey. Because I would say that we've been talking about it in sort of sociological terms of how the church has some distinctive traits that can be activated to be a healing agent. However, we who are actually in the church, who are following Jesus, we don't really think of ourselves as just a sociological agent, with distinctive sociological traits. We actually feel like we know Jesus and we have the Spirit of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, indwelling us both individually, but especially when 2 or 3 are gathered in our name, when in our communities, when in our small groups, that there is something other than just sociology at work. There's something spiritual at work. I'm super curious for how you study and narrate that dynamic. And because I think, one of the things that I think Christians get a little antsy or nervous about when sociologists, when social scientists look at us is that we fear we are going to get also reduced, maybe not into the political categories, but we're going to be reduced into sociological categories. Like, oh, what you're experiencing, Weber would explain as blah, 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 right? Or Durkheim or whatever, right? So how do you, as a social scientist, look at a church, look at people's experiences in their faith lives and hold all that into account?
Yeah. So maybe there are 2 ways that I'll sort of answer that. One, just talk a little bit about my own personal experience, and then second, talk a little bit about the book and how I try to sort of handle that in the book. So I will admit, when I first started doing work with Undivided and Crossroads, I was a little apprehensive about how they might relate to me, because I was coming from the East Coast. I was doing this is a church that's based in Cincinnati. I'm a college professor. I was raised Catholic, and I was, I'm seeking still, and so it sort of felt like there are a lot of kind of like categories that I ticked that didn't necessarily fit the mold of who might be welcome into this, and I think what I really appreciated from the outset is that, people dealt with me as a whole person, so often like I would reach out to people and I would say, so and so suggested that I reach out to you, and here's why I'm reaching out, and I'm trying to understand this program Undivided, and I understand you just went through it or something like that. And, and people would often start just by asking me about myself, like, oh, well, where are you from? And how did you get into this work? And, why are you interested in us? And I think being able to have that conversation where first we established a relationship and then we were able to then dive into the conversation that I wanted to have, it gave me an experience of the fullness, both of how people in Undivided and people in Crossroads are treating each other, and the kind of way in which they would approach each other. But then also the way in which, all of these people kind of understood their relationship to Jesus as kind of informing the way in which they wanted to interact with anyone, whether or not it was someone who was naturally or kind of instinctually sort of a part of their community. And so I think the fullness of that experience, I think, certainly shaped the way I came to understand and feel a part of, this community that I was studying, so to speak. But then the second thing I'll just sort of say is that in thinking about the book, there are a lot of books where this is like a big thing that I had to realize is that there are a lot of books where the structure of the book is through a set of ideas, right? The narrative structure of the book is trying to make an argument about a set of ideas that it's trying to advance. And I felt like that wasn't right for this book, that this is a book where the narrative really had to be structured around a set of people's experiences, because that's a better way, I think, through story to capture the fullness of what it means to be in a relationship with God, to grapple with the way in which that manifests in all these different kind of aspects of someone's life, to have to confront sort of divisiveness, in whether it's in your family or in your workplace or your church or however it was that people experienced it. Doing that through story was, I think, more faithful to the way in which people kind of experienced it themselves than doing it where I was trying to make an argument about a set of ideas and then slotting in examples, where they fit, because then it inevitably loses some of the nuance that emerges. And so, I mean, obviously, like, readers will have to make their own judgments. I hope that I was able to be faithful to the stories and the experiences that the characters in the book had, but I tried to sort of make it feel very real to them. And I will say I've been really, I've had, some early people who've read the book. Like, one of the things that a couple of the pastors who read it said to me is like, this feels like people I know in my own community. And I think that there are a couple comments like that made me feel like, oh, thank goodness, that's what I was hoping for, that would feel like real people that you knew, even if you didn't know these specific people, obviously.
Hahrie, introduce us to one of those people. Give us the short version of that experience.
Yeah, so there is a woman. So one of the characters is a woman named Jess, who she was originally from Florida and then grew up and then moved to Ohio. Her father, had the words white power tattooed on the back of his arms. And so she grew up with an experience of church that at first was very punitive. It felt like the church was an instrument of punishment and exclusion and conformity. Like, it was teaching her that she had to be a certain way as a white woman. And then she ended up becoming, so she's kind of like lost. She never had a real independent relationship with God, I think, growing up. It was more something that her parents made her do. She became addicted to opioids in high school, eventually did some time in prison. And then while she was doing her time, she developed a relationship with a guard who basically introduced her to Jesus in a different way, where she could form an independent relationship with Jesus. And she talks about how powerful it was, because, if you have one thing in prison, you have a lot of time. And she kind of poured through the Bible, and she realized that, the Jesus that's in the Bible is actually very different than what she had understood when she was a child. And so she kind of came out of prison with a commitment to Jesus, but then having to figure out how to sustain that in a much more complicated world, And that's when she found Crossroads. And so first she joined Crossroads for a few years, didn't really get involved in anything like Undivided. But then when Undivided came around, sort of realized that this felt like the right moment for her to begin to re-examine her understandings about race in America, because she had obviously grown up with a specific set of values that were imparted from her parents. And so she walks into, these mixed race kind of small groups in Undivided, really, knowing very little about about American history, about, any other kind of racial disparities that exist in society. And it just kind of opened her eyes to a whole set of things that she had never really been exposed to, and then animated her to kind of get involved in all sorts of work coming out of the program. So she got involved in some of the Onramps and continued to sustain it afterwards. And so, so she's one example. Just another one more is there's a Black woman named Sandra who grew up in a Black Christian family in California, moved to Ohio in her young adulthood, had been part of a mega church in California, joined Crossroads because it was a very familiar kind of church for her in Ohio, and was married to a white man. And her oldest child was going to start kindergarten school when Undivided first happened. And so she was part of the inaugural class of Undivided, and she wanted to join because she realized she was having trouble kind of navigating issues about race and racial difference in her family, and they were becoming more relevant as her oldest son became older. And so that's what animated her to get involved in Undivided. But then it ended up opening for her a whole line of questioning about what her relationship to her own racial identity was, how it had changed in moving from California to Ohio, and so what she wanted to be moving forward. And the last thing I should just say is that all of this, the book takes place from like 2016 to 2022 or so. And so it kind of goes through the Trump presidency as well as George Floyd. And so you can imagine Sandra and Jess grappling with these kinds of questions in the context of a really tumultuous world.
Wow, those are amazing stories. I can't wait to dive them more. Listeners, please, if those stories sound like inspiring, insightful stories, please check out Undivided by Hahrie Han. It's a wonderful book. It's a gift, I think, to the broader secular society to open their eyes to the potential for healing. It's an important book, I think, for the church, for pastors, for leaders, for those involved in the church to read, to realize kind of our calling as people, as agents of God's healing in this world. Hahrie, thank you so much for telling that story. Thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing. It is a gift not just to the field, but to the church and to our society. It's a privilege to partner with you on the After Party.
Well, thank you for inviting me into this conversation, but also just for the partnership with the After Party. Like we could have a similar conversation just about the After Party, and I've learned so much through that partnership. So I'm really grateful for your willingness to bring us into it. So thank you.
Well, when we get the results, get our findings, we're going to have you back on, and we're going to take things apart and see what we've learned. And but it's so great to be able to work together with a scholar like you, Hahrie. And so, listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation. We hope you've come to realize that if the need to belong to community, to belong to Christian community, if you are one of those people who I think is very much kind of a category for our audience, people who are feeling like they're in the wilderness, and one of the things that they feel like they've lost is maybe a church community, and they are wandering, either actually not having a church community, they've left it, or they're part of one, but they feel alienated and disconnected in some way. We hope that this conversation inspires you to keep trying, to keep asking God to provide that community, because we all need campfires, not just virtual campfires like a podcast community, but actual campfire communities with real people that we are gathering together and sharing casseroles, as well as really important conversations with. So once again, next week, we will gather around this particular campfire.